Did you know that 70% of people do not have an emergency fund and they live paycheck to paycheck? What happens when that paycheck does not come? Oh, it's a wild ride. I'm going to tell you through this video. My younger, naive self did not have an emergency fund, and the unforgettable emergencies I found myself in without that emergency fund, and how devastating that was for me. So what exactly is an emergency fund? An emergency fund, also known as a rainy day fund. An emergency fund is a pot of money that is easily accessible, but also out of sight, out of mind, so you do not spend it on things willy-nilly. An emergency fund is like a savings account. It's a place where you put that money and you think, if something goes wrong in my life, when something goes wrong in my life, I at least have this money to back me up. Now, my personal advice is to have an emergency fund of a minimum of £1,000, but you want to actually aim for the goal of having 6 months of your expenditures. If for some reason you lose your job and things start breaking down in your home, having that 6 months of your expenditures will support you through that difficult time and allow you to start a new job and not rush into a new job that is underpaid, that is a terrible place to work. You can take your time and you can actually go for the dream jobs, the jobs that you actually want. So having an emergency fund is super, super important from my point of view as a certified financial planner. As you go through this journey called life, there is a guarantee that life will knock you down. It's a journey, not a holiday. It's an adventure. It's not a holiday. It's an adventure, this life. So you will get knocked down and you've got to find ways to get out of those situations. You will get knocked down and you've got to find a way to solve that puzzle on how to get back up again. And an emergency fund is super helpful when it comes to life kicking you down. The first example when life kicked me down, when I was not prepared, when I did not have that emergency fund, was a real painful one for me. I remember it vividly. Was when myself and my wife were traveling through Europe. We were in Austria at the time. We were between two huge big lakes. It was very rural around that area. There was not much going on. And we parked up, we camped for the night. And when it came to setting off in the morning, we tried to turn that engine on and it just would not go. I was devastated. And to my naivety, I actually did not have breakdown cover. That absolutely killed me, because someone like me who works in finance and actually has a close relationship with insurance and breakdown cover, I genuinely just forgot to get breakdown cover. That emergency fund, that protection that I needed in a foreign land where not many people speak my language, I did not have that cover. So I was stuck. What could I do? I'm in the middle of nowhere. There's no phone signal. You can't call anyone. So we had to go and hike to a place, to the next village, to find a place where we could get some phone signal. We called the breakdown services that we know here in the UK, because we didn't know any breakdown services outside of the UK. So we called the ones in the UK and said, please, can you help me? We knew this was going to be expensive. We knew this was going to be crazy, that this was a painful one. They put us in contact with someone there in Austria who did eventually come out. We had to get the vehicle towed to a repairing garage. The vehicle had to be fixed and we had to pay for that. That in itself ate into our traveling fund massively. Had I prepared for this, had I had that money aside for vehicle maintenance, had I purchased breakdown cover before we left the country, I would have been prepared for that, and I would have seen that future expense coming around and we would have been taken care of. But in this case, we had to pay a lot of money, which really did eat into our travel experience and depleted our funds quite quickly. Fortunately enough, we did not have to go and borrow money in this situation, but we had money to go and travel, and we want to use that money to go and enjoy travel. However, a lot of it, a big chunk of that money, was used to fix the vehicle so we could continue traveling, and the recovery and the uplift. The recovery itself should have only cost like £100, but because we had to call a UK company to put us in contact with a company in Austria, it was like £500 just for the recovery, and having that foreign contract that could help us out in that situation. So we were not prepared for that. Admittedly, it was a mistake in that situation. I absolutely knew that's something that we needed, but with everything going on before traveling, it was just a mistake that we forgot to prepare for if the vehicle breaks down. So that in itself can be an emergency fund. Having insurance and protection can be something there to help you through that emergency. And that was a real painful one. To this day, I remember how down and how low I was. I was hanging my head in shame, especially because someone like me in my profession should have absolutely known to get that breakdown cover, and I didn't, and hanged my head in shame at the time. Now I look back at it and think, okay, that was part of the adventure. That's something that had to happen. I now shelf that pain and say, okay, it happened. I'm never going to let that happen again. But I'm also not going to let it torture me anymore. I'm not going to let those mistakes torture me going forward, because that's not healthy for anyone. There was another time when the boiler broke down. The boiler was breaking down for years. It was old and rusty, and I still, even looking at it, making funny noises and doing things that it probably shouldn't have been doing. It was probably more riskier to have that boiler than I was willing to accept at the time. But replacing a boiler is a huge expense, and at a certain point I had to replace it. Boiler service repair mechanics, I was asking them to come out and service the boiler to try and keep it going, to try and keep it moving. However, they refused. They were saying, no, I am not touching this boiler. I'm not going to touch it anymore. And even then, I still didn't listen. I still kept using the same boiler. But even then, with all these warning signs and all these red flags, I was still young and naive, and I did not realize that I should be saving up for a new boiler. It's extremely important that I should be saving up for that new boiler and getting that at the earliest opportunity. But I still didn't do that. I still just waited for it to break down. And eventually, when it was at its coldest possible point, I personally think that contributed towards it breaking down as well. The really cold temperatures, the cold water going through the pipes, I think that may have contributed towards it breaking down as well. But at the coldest possible point is when the boiler actually broke down, and I had to replace it. I could not allow my wife and my pets to live in this house freezing cold without a boiler, but I did not have the emergency fund to pay for it at the time. I actually had to go into my investments in this situation. I still thankfully managed to avoid debt, but I had to then go into my investments, which annoyingly at the time were underperforming. I was forced to cash out an investment at a loss. I did not want to do that. I had to cash it out because having heat in my home was far more important than my investments making money. So I had to cash out those investments at a loss at pretty much the bottom of the market in 2022. I had to cash out those investments and buy myself a boiler. I've got a new boiler now, it works, and I'm saving up for a new boiler as well. So that is great news. So when this one eventually breaks down, I'll be ready and prepared for a new boiler. However, then the market turned around. The market was dropping. I withdrew my money at a loss, and then the market turned around and went back up. So the opportunity that I lost in the market was because I was not prepared with an emergency fund for that boiler breaking down. If I already had an emergency fund, I would have just paid for a new boiler, bought a new boiler, and my investments could have recovered and I would have made a lot of money. So having an emergency fund can protect your investments from having to be cashed out at an inconvenient time, at a bad time in the market. Another example, when I needed an emergency fund and I was still too young and naive to realize that I needed an emergency fund, was when my laptop broke down. My laptop broke down at a time when I needed it. I was using it to make money at the time. I was actually doing some match betting. It's completely legal, by the way, but I was actually doing match betting. I was making quite a lot of money on match betting at the time. However, when the laptop broke down, I was stuck without a laptop and without any money to buy a laptop as well, which was super, super frustrating because it was a means to making money. So with the laptop breaking down, that stopped me making money. It was my means of making some money at the time. It was a side hustle where I was making money. So that just came to a stop because the laptop itself stopped working. This time, unfortunately, in my younger, naive self, I did have to get out finance for that laptop. I had to buy a new laptop on finance. Later on, when I realized that debt is bad, I did pay that finance off and that finance is gone forever. But at the time, I had to put myself into debt. I had to pay interest that I didn't expect to pay. I had to take a loan out for that new laptop so I could start making money again. So I did get a new laptop. I did get it on finance. I did now have debt and was paying an interest on that debt that I did not prepare to pay for in the first place. If I had an emergency fund, I would have just bought a new laptop and I would not have had to pay that interest. That interest was an extra expense that I did not have to pay if I had an emergency fund. If you like this type of content on living a rich and fulfilling life, preparing for retirement, going from zero to a millionaire, talking about Bitcoin, having hints and tips on how you can be financially successful in your life, then hit the like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you can watch all the future videos coming out on this channel. So these are just a few examples of how I survived without an emergency fund during difficult times. And these were not great experiences for me. I was really low during these times. I was really upset about how things panned out. Now though, I'm much more emotionally aware these days. I do now have an emergency fund and it has protected me in much worse situations than the ones I have told you about today. For example, I had an emergency situation very recently. I bought a new house as a buy-to-let property where I would put a tenant in that house. I did not expect the house to need a new rewire. So when I had that phone call to say this house needs a complete rewire on the house and it's going to cost thousands, yes, I was upset. I did not want that to happen. However, I had the cash on hand to say, there you go. There's the thousands of pounds you need to rewire this entire house. You need to make it safe for the tenant that is moving in. There is all the money for you. Here you go. That is yours. Go and sort it out. And that was sorted. I did not need to go in debt. I did not need to withdraw any investments or anything like that. I put the money straight into the house and now the house is safe and secure and it's passing electrical safety checks. But I was prepared this time. I had an emergency fund this time. And that was worse. That was more expensive than any of these other experiences when I did not have an emergency fund. But I was prepared. It wasn't great. I wasn't happy, but it had to be done. And I did it and I was capable of doing it and rewiring the house and getting a tenant in the house so they can create a safe family home. So with this, it is extremely important for you to have an emergency fund. It can protect you in ways that you do not foresee. It can make those really difficult times feel like it's nothing. By the time that you get into your 30s, I guarantee that life will have kicked you at some point. If it's never kicked you, it will kick you eventually. Just know that something will happen, a black swan event that you cannot foresee coming. It will happen. Get an emergency fund. That is your top priority. Get an emergency fund as soon as possible. You have to have that money aside for when shit hits the fan. But also when shit does hit the fan, just remember, yes, in that initial moment, it hurts, you're down, it's not great, but shelf it. Put that on the shelf for you to see forever. But don't hold on to it. Don't carry it around with you. Don't let it weigh you down. Put it on the shelf. Know it happened. Never let it happen again. But do not torture yourself over this. It's not going to benefit anyone. Put it on the shelf, but don't carry it. If you carry it, it's just going to weigh you down. Just put it on the shelf. Reminder, you know it happened and you're never going to let that mistake happen again because you are going to have an emergency fund. So I've just told you my examples of difficult times that I've been through without an emergency fund and how I got out of them and the problems that I had. Leave a comment in the description below. I'd love to hear what you think. Have you had any situations that have been super difficult and you did not have an emergency fund that converted you to the person that does now have an emergency fund? What happened in that situation? How did you get out of it? What would you have done differently? Write in the comments below. I'd love to hear your experiences. If you like this type of content with tips and advice on emergency fund, I'm sure you're going to want to watch this video on sinking funds and how the wealthy use sinking funds to get ahead in life. So watch this video right here. I know you're going to love it.